with the first panel, and I'll go straight to that. And this is something I guess for everyone to just bear in mind, is that the question I think that we're looking to answer here is, what is the role of the police, and how should it evolve over the next 20 years? And I should say that the discussion that we're going to have this afternoon will hopefully inform and influence, I guess, the kind of review of policing which the Police Foundation are undertaking, and Rick, who's the director of Police Foundation, will explain about that a bit more. But for this, I guess, first panel session, again, to repeat, that the focus is around answering the question, what is the role of the police and how should it evolve over the next 20 years? And I guess that there's a kind of quote that's probably worth noting here, which came from a blog which was attached to the strategic review, which is the police should engage with the arguments behind the defund movement. It is time to rethink the role and purpose of policing. And that came from a blog in July this year. So without further ado, I'll kind of introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Rick Muir, who's the director of the Police Foundation. And Rick has been a public policy researcher for most of his career, and most recently, or most latterly, in relation to public service reform, including policing and criminal justice policy at the Institute for Public Policy Research. So over to you, Rick. Very welcome, and thanks for agreeing to lead us off.
Thanks very much, Kevin, and thanks to Nina, Jamie, and everybody else for inviting me. And yeah, I mean, it's a big question, the role of the police. And just to say a bit of background, as Kevin was saying, at the Police Foundation, we're hosting a strategic review of policing in England and Wales at the moment. That's been going for most of the last year. We've just finished a piece of work which is trying to set out what we think the challenge facing the country is in terms of public safety and security, and now we're getting into all of the big policy questions about, well, what kind of police service do we need to respond to the challenge that we've identified? And we'll be publishing a final report in October of next year. So, and this discussion will very much contribute to our thinking. So thank you all for participating. In terms of the role of the police, I think that there isn't really a right or wrong answer to this question. And you know, the role of the police is something which has to be debated by every society over time, and at different points in history, slightly different positions might be taken on that question. One thing which I think is, one conclusion that we've made in the review is that the traditional ways of answering the question, what is the role of the police, aren't particularly satisfactory. One way in which society has tried to answer that question is simply by listing what the police do and asserting that that is what the police ought to do. So if you look at the 1962 Royal Commission on the Police, which is the last time we had a Royal Commission into policing, they asked what is the role of the police, and then they simply listed sort of 10 things which the police happened to do at the time and said that is the role of the police. Now, personally, I don't think that's turning an is into an ought is not, without any argument, is not necessarily a good idea. It doesn't help us with one of the key questions, which is prioritization. At the moment, the police are very stretched. They can't do everything that they're being asked to do. And so just sort of listing functions is not a particularly helpful way, I think, of describing the role of the police or determining what it should be. So I don't like that approach. And in strategic review, we'll try to have a more developed approach to answering this question. The other way in which people have tried to answer this question is by going back to the Pelian principles, which are the kind of founding principles of British policing. The problem with the Pelian principles, while I agree with a lot that's in the Pelian principles, is they're better on the how of policing rather than the what. So they tend to talk about that police should use minimal force, that they should try to prevent crime rather than just simply respond to it, and so on. And a lot of that is about the how the police do their job rather than what the job is. So I don't dismiss the Peelian principles. I think there's a lot of really important stuff in there, but I don't think it's that helpful with answering this question as we face it today. There's some particular contemporary reasons for wanting to address this question. And one is simply that policing at the moment is very stretched. There have been cuts to the police budget of around a reduction of about 25% in government grants of police forces, a reduction of around 20% since 2010 in terms of the resources available to policing. And so a big reduction in resources over the last decade. And at the same time, we've seen a rise in particularly more complex forms of demand on the police. So they've had it's true that volume crime has fallen over the last 20 years, things like burglary and car crime and so on. But lots of other forms of demand on the police have increased, particularly forms of demand linked to multiple disadvantage. The number of mental health incidents the police respond to has increased. The number of missing person incidents the police respond to has increased. The number of reported sexual offences reported to the police has increased very dramatically in the last 5 years. And there's been this explosion in cybercrime, so the crime shifting from the offline world to the online world. So police work has become, if anything, more demanding and more complex, and at the same time, the budgets have been reduced. So that forces the police to ask, what should we be doing? What should we be prioritising? And actually, I don't think there's been any real proper democratic or explicit discussion about what the answer to these questions should be. The police, as they often do, have reacted pragmatically to the situation. So they've adapted their work, they've prioritised things largely based on an assessment of harm, and gone and done that. But there's been very little kind of public discussion about what the role should be and what should be prioritised. So I've sort of described some of the reasons for wanting to answer the question and why it's a complicated question. In terms of giving an answer to that question, I mean, I think there are basically two things which are at the core of the police role, which I don't think many people argue with, although we might want to qualify them and discuss them. One is that the police clearly investigate crimes and bring suspects before the court. They've always done that. They have the powers to do that. It's very hard to think of anyone else who would legitimately do that in a democratic society based on the rule of law. And so the police, I think, will always have that, if you like, investigative role, and that role in terms of bringing suspects before the court. That, I think, is core. Now, we might have a debate about whether criminal justice system is always the answer to some of the problems that the police might encounter, and you know, we might bring fewer people before the courts, for example. I know that's something that many CJA members would agree with, and I would as well. But I think there will always be a core role for the police there around criminal investigation. The second thing, which is important, you know, I think it's really important to acknowledge that the police role is not just, and never has been, just about crime. Theresa May famously said, it's, you know, your job is to tackle crime, nothing more, nothing less. And, you know, that's news to a lot of people in policing, because I think if you talk to them, they spend a lot of time doing a lot of other things as well, and always have done. And that takes us to Egon Bittner's famous description of the role of the police, which is the police are asked to respond in situations where something is happening that ought not to be happening and about which somebody ought to do something now. In other words, the core role of the police for Egon Bittner was reactive public assistance. So there's a concern about harm. It might be to do with crime, it might not be. And somebody needs to get out there and respond to it and to deal with the problem. And generally, as Bittner says, what the police do is provide a provisional solution to the situation. And of course, and there are good reasons, I think, why the police have a general response function. And that's because they get a lot of, somebody needs to have a general response function. There's lots of incidents, you know, the fire service has a specific response function around fire, the ambulance service around medical attention. The police have a more general response function. And, you know, often when something bad is happening, it's not very clear what it is that's going on. And so you need somebody to get out there and assess the situation. And that generally is what the police do. They are also, the people who do that general response function, generally also people who are going to need the power over the use of non-negotiable force. You know, there will be dangerous situations which the police, which need to be dealt with, and having the legal powers that the police have will be important in those situations. And so I think at the core of the police, those two things around criminal investigation and what I call reactive public assistance, I think are at the core of it. But I just want to say three things before I finish, about which I think need attention and discussion in the years ahead. One is there's a big debate, I think, about the role of the police in prevention. And lots of people say, well, the Pelian principles say the police should be involved in preventing crime. Most of what the police do is not really about crime prevention. It's generally about reacting to stuff that's happened already, although there may be a preventative element to the way in which they react to those things. But you'll hear from, you know, certainly from some of the debate in America around Black Lives Matter and defund the police, there's a concern that there's been a bit of overreach, you know, that the police are sort of getting involved in things that aren't really their remit, things that might be better handled by other agencies and so on. And so I think there's a debate to be had about what specifically the role of the police is in prevention, and how they should. I think there is an important role, but I think we've got to be careful that the police don't end up sort of overreaching into things that they're not the right people to be dealing with. I don't think anyone thinks it's satisfactory that the police are the main response service in this country for dealing with mental health incidents. I think everybody finds that quite problematic, including the police themselves. And so I think we need to have a think about the parameters there. The other area is what's the role of the police online? Because the two things which I said were at the core of the police role, criminal investigation, bringing people before the courts, and reactive public assistance, it's not entirely clear what any of that means online. In terms of bringing people before the courts, most people who commit online offences are not caught. You know, I mean, cybercrime and fraud, for example, that lead to very few convictions. And generally that's because they're quite complex, and often the offenders are operating overseas. And so it's not very clear that they ever will be brought before the courts. So what is the role of the police in terms of cybercrime? It might be more about disruption than about apprehension. There's also the third area, which I think I'd like to sort of close on, is in the review, we're really keen to think about policing as part of a system. And I don't think we've thought enough about policing as part of a system. And some of the debates in America have started talking about public safety systems. And I think this is a really important contribution, because, you know, you talk to anyone who works in policing and they'll say, you know, all of the issues they deal with need a response. Not just, I mean, people talk about multi-agency response, but it's not just about agencies, it's also about the community. You know, it's about what can we all do to make our lives safer. So we've got to think about policing as part of a wider public safety system. And I think we need to do so more explicitly, because when the police are faced with this challenge of rising demand and reduced resource, well, one way of dealing that would be to sort of just look at the role of the police and kind of chop bits of it off and say, well, no, we're not going to deal with missing persons anymore, or we're not going to deal with mental health incidents anymore. I don't think you can do that for the reasons that I set out earlier. I think the police are always going to have a general response function, and I think that's quite important. Somebody needs to do it, and I think I personally don't think they're the right people to do it. But the issue, so rather than just sort of chopping bits off in principle of the police role, I think it's much better to think about policing as part of a wider system and address, you know, why is it that so many people with mental health problems are getting into crisis? How can we reduce that? And how do we work with the health system in order to do that? Why is it there are so many people sleeping on the street? What are we going to do about that? You know, there isn't a policing solution to it, even if the police are called out to deal with these things often. So thinking about policing as part of that system and being much more explicit about it, both locally and nationally, I think is a core way that I think is the best solution to this challenge of reduced resource and increased demand. And sorry, I've probably spoken for too long, so I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks very much, Rick. That's been a really really helpful, I think, opener actually for the rest of the discussion that we're going to have. And in particular, I think I was particularly kind of interested in the point you made about policing as part of a system. And it's certainly systemic change and thinking about terms and systems is something that I think as an alliance we've been doing quite a lot of thinking about, and so I think that sort of chimes with I think the things that we're doing. Before I move on to our next speaker, I just wanted to say that at the point when all three speakers in this panel session have had the chance to kind of have some input, is we'll welcome kind of questions and comments from the audience. What we'd like you to do, I suppose, is when we get to that point, if you've got some questions, then you can put them in the chat kind of ready, and we'll try and pick that up, and so that we'll ask you to actually to speak those questions and say that, so we've got it kind of on record, as it were, in terms of the recording. Okay, but it would help maybe as a kind of precursor if things occur to you as you know, based on just what Rick said or what the other two speakers are going to say, then please put it in the chat and I'll try and pick that up, and then maybe kind of ask you to kind of maybe elaborate on that. And I think everyone's able to unmute themselves, or if not, then I think Jamie will do that. Okay, that's great. So I'd like to welcome our second speaker for this panel session, and that's Whitney Isles, who's the CEO of Project 507. And Whitney's had a range of professional roles and has over 18 years experience as a frontline practitioner working with young people and communities affected by violence. So Whitney, if you'd like to give us your thoughts, that'd be great.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yep.
Firstly, I apologize for being late today. I became a carer this week and I am just in the process of sorting out many things all at once. And if anyone's ever been a carer, I think you'll sympathize with the process of that. So I come to this discussion with a bit more of an outsider's view of someone who has been working in the community for kind of several years, almost 2 decades now. And for the last decade, been also working in the criminal justice system, specifically in the prison estate as well. And what my organization specializes in is violence reduction, and using a kind of what's now called a trauma-informed kind of therapeutic approach to working with mainly young people, but now kind of adolescents and kind of young adults up to the age of around 35 who have been affected by violence, but also those who are perpetrators of violence in prison for violent offences, and then, you know, violent within the prison estate. So that's kind of the grounds for that. And I have both therapeutic training in kind of psychotherapy and forensic psychotherapy, but also, you know, I've been in academia. So I've looked at this from an academic perspective, especially, you know, in my kind of master's, looking at things in relation to security and state violence. So I don't really sit on either side of the fence. And one of the things that I've always really been interested in is kind of really critical thinking around key issues and what we can always do and how we can work together to move forward in that. So I enjoy the fact that I have the frontline experience, so I understand the nuances of how things are actually kind of affected in the community. Like what does this look like? What do these policies look like at a grassroots level? As well as, you know, I've done work with the Secretary of State for Justice and the Prison Minister. So I've worked on a lot of different levels. So it's afforded me the experience and, you know, the ability to see things on different levels. And for me, when we start thinking about the police, there's two kind of main issues that come to mind. And I wanted to kind of see what I could bring to the conversation that perhaps others might not have, or I kind of foresaw what kind of others might bring to the conversation and wanted to add something slightly different to that. So my first kind of big issue in relation to the police and kind of emergency responders in general, or anyone that's doing front-facing work, is the level of trauma that is dealt with, both primary and secondary trauma, whether, you know, and that's physical and psychological. So, you know, anyone that's doing front-facing work where you are, you know, you're putting yourself at risk in these situations. So that's your risk to self, but you're also having to deal with kind of being involved in horrific situations. Okay, so there's a very person-centered approach to this. And, you know, from my kind of my interactions with the police. And what I tend to see is, you know, individuals that are completely overworked, undertrained in particular areas like mental health. So just not having the skill set to deal with particular situations, which is, you know, not necessarily their fault, or most times not their fault, but kind of overall not particularly cared for in roles. So, you know, where is the reflective practice? Where is the clinical supervision? And I know that it's starting to kind of seep its way into the kind of policing systems. But, you know, from an outsider's perspective, what I tend to kind of get the feeling of is, even if you're going to see a counselor or get that emotional support, you're kind of looked down on. It's kind of like, oh, but you're not, you know, you're not good enough at this job. So there's this, you know, there's this person-centered approach that we need to be thinking about. Who is doing the job? How are we getting the right people in these posts, and how are we supporting them with the longevity of this? And it's, you know, we see the same things for prison officers. And I think when we start to see kind of issues around funding in society and lack of funds, then what we start to see is kind of younger officers, you know, coming on board, less life experience. And then we've also got the idea of, you know, London is a kind of perfect example of, you know, London is London. And if you're from London, you get that. But if you're from outside of London, it's a whole different culture. And we're not just talking about race and ethnicity, you know, I'm from South London, and South London, you know, we have a lot of different culture there. And what I see when I, you know, work with guys in prisons kind of up north, and the prison officers and the governors are talking about their London boys, you always know who the London boys are. But it is around a particular type of culture. So, you know, what we have is a lot of people coming into things that are different, seeing things for the first time. And then also on top of that is, you know, the level of trauma being dealt with, even hearing trauma, you know, and hearing what colleagues have dealt with, that vicarious trauma, that secondary trauma, that is just kind of sitting in individuals. And when that starts to sit in individuals, what you tend to see is that will seep into organization and organization infrastructure, and, you know, how everything works. And what you end up with is a lot of projection, a lot of transference and counter transference, and it just becomes a mess. Yeah, in any organization that's dealing with a lot of trauma, you know, if it's not being kind of dealt with and processed, what you'll see is it will kind of make its way into organizational culture, and you start to see that through language, you start to see that through behavior. So for me, there is this kind of big personal aspect of, there are people, you know, at the center of all of this. And some of those people may not have a place in the police, and some of those people we might not want in the police. But actually, you know, when you speak to a lot of police officers, there are a lot of people that want to do good and are just having to deal with kind of horrific amounts. And I also speak on that, you know, previously being the chair of the Independent Advisory Board for Greenwich Police. So I've sat there, been involved in police investigations, and know the kind of high level of trauma that is being dealt with. So there is this issue here that I think we need to really think about in relation to people and how we look after people. Because if we don't look after police officers as people, that is going to have a ripple effect. The second point to that is systems. So we've got people and we've got systems. And we have to be careful that when we are speaking about systems and structures, we are not talking about the people. The people are involved and a lot of the times are also the same victims of these systems and structures. So when I'm critical of the police, I'm critical of the police as an institution and as a structure. And I think this is, you know, for me, we need to have some real kind of critical dialogue, real kind of hard conversations around the police and what the Policing Institute kind of stands for, because we are talking about an organization that is here to enforce policy and laws. And what we see in this, you know, in this country is, you know, and we see the same in America, is we have a lot of laws and a lot of kind of legal systems that can be very oppressive and racist. You know, these are conversations that we're starting to be a little bit more open to. So when you've got a kind of a wider system that is, or that can be oppressive, or will have oppressive arms to it or racist arms to it, and we look at laws like joint enterprise, for example, and, you know, if the police officers themselves have to enforce these laws, which is what they do, you know, there is an argument to say that, you know, the police as an institute is a tool for state violence, because it is a tool that also perpetuates the harms that are kind of put together by government. So there is a whole big kind of discussion that needs to be had here, and we can really get into the ins and outs of it. And I think, you know, what we start to do now is we start to think more about kind of trauma-informed policing. And I just want to say from the get-go, we have to be very careful with these conversations, because, you know, there is this aspect of, can something truly be trauma-informed if it's also trauma reactive or trauma-inducing, similar to the prisoner state? And then when we start to think about kind of more community-based policing and policing in relationship to community-based organizations, I think when we have these conversations today, I would like to make sure that we frame that around the power dynamics that are also at play. And we're constantly thinking about the different ways that power intersect and who is involved in these partnerships, in these structures, and who can kind of, you know, where is the power held, basically, in a lot of these just different conversations. So what I would like to do today is just help to provide that kind of critical dialogue. I've said critical a million and one times today, it could have been a game, you know, but that real kind of critical thinking in this process, but to understand that we need to look after the people, but we can look after the people while kind of actually thinking in quite depth around the systems that are potentially doing harm to those officers, but also the wider community. Thank you.
That's great. Many thanks for that, Whitney. Sorry to kind of cut you short there. Slightly separately. I'm just conscious of time. But I mean, I think that the point you raised about sort of differential power dynamics is a very important point for us to sort of take away and to consider. So moving swiftly on then. So we've, according to my sort of timetable, we've got till just after kind of 2:30, I think, for this session. Maybe a little bit longer than that. So for our next speaker, I'd like to introduce Chief Inspector Jack Rowlands from the Metropolitan Police and the London Violence Reduction Unit. And Jack's been a police officer for 17 years, and he's been concentrating, I think, since 2010 on tackling the root causes of violence, and has created a number of award-winning diversion programs, one of these being, I think, the Divert scheme, which I think was developed in collaboration with Lambeth Council. So, Jack, if you'd like to provide us with your thoughts and input, and if you could kind of keep it to 8 minutes, and what I might do, I might just kind of give you a nudge on the chat if that's okay, when you're getting a bit close. But sorry about that.
No worries at all, Kevin. No worries. I'll keep an eye on the time. So 8 minutes starts now. Good afternoon, everyone. As I'm Jack Rowlands, Chief Inspector in the Met. And yeah, just listening to Rick and Whitney's points there. I mean, first of all, having been a police officer for 17 years, I think for me, what I'm understanding is that the police have a real part to play around collaboration and generally symbiotically working with organisations and people across London and the wider UK. I feel that if we get relationships right and we work closely with organisations where sometimes the police are sometimes too quick to take the lead on situations and take too quick on finding solutions, that working collaboratively with organisations and people usually is something that we need to adapt to and we need to change ourselves, because sometimes, as I say, we take the lead too strongly. For me, with the collaboration element, it has to be symbiotic, and Rick touched on mental health being a massive demand in policing, which it is. And, you know, the fact that when a mental health crisis happens, the first person that picks that call up is the police. And for us, you know, that is one element of what we need to look at in the future around what demands are being placed on us and how can we collaboratively work, still have that part to play, but collaboratively work with NHS and partners in how we can have the best possible care for that person. Are policing always going to be the best person to deal with that? No, they're not. It's the same for vulnerability, looked after children and children that go missing. We've got so many organisations and people in organisations that would be better suited to deal with that. Police having a part to play, but not being the primary response and the primary body that deals with that. But for me, I think what I have seen over the years is a real area of innovation with policing. You You know, I believe, as you know, in diversion and helping young people away from crime and violence. And I've only ever been able to do that working with people and organisations and forming that symbiotic relationship. And even though now that Divert is established and it's working really well, it is really led by youth workers and organisations that work with police. It's not police-led. And for me, that's an example of how you can collaborate with organisations that have that real sort of common purpose of making our society safer. And what could have happened in the past is policing could have completely dominated the Divert programme, and I was always very mindful of that. And actually, by taking a step back, having an overview and work collaboratively, we're not just achieving outcomes for policing, more so and more importantly, we're achieving outcomes for young people and helping to contribute to that wider piece around prevention that Rick was talking about. And I think that with my colleagues, there is a real cultural sort of understanding now that they want to find solutions and they want to start working with other people. Now, one thing I have done in the Met in the recent times is create the Violence Reduction Champions Network, 300 officers and staff strong, all looking at finding ways of collaboratively working with organisations and people in finding those solutions and those pathways, so that when policing does come across someone in need, because we always will do, it's just the nature of our job, how can we work collaboratively using technology, using relationships to get the best outcome for that person in front of us right now? And I think for us, our frustration sometimes is we're still bogged down in statutory service that is not particularly great with IT, that can sometimes otherwise take weeks and months for others to pick up that demand. And policing is very much around what can we do now? You know, what's the proactive element of us being timely? But the point that I want to also bring up, and Whitney absolutely nailed it, was the trauma-informed and trauma-responsive element of policing. Now, that is one element that we really need to invest in, because the fact is that when you get police officers involved in violent offences and traumatic offences, you get traumatised people dealing with traumatised events. And what then tends to happen is, you know, Whitney touched on it, you get cultural and organisational trauma, because what's happening in police is we don't have those outlets, not even to understand our own trauma, let alone starting to understand other people's trauma. And I think the investment around being trauma-informed so that we can empathise and build bridges and relationships with people in our communities is really important. But at the same time, having systems to support police officers to understand and deal with their own trauma collectively. Because what's happening is, and I speak from personal experience, I've stopped and dealt with incidents and I've reacted differently because I am traumatized. And because I didn't deal with my trauma, I dealt with it in a different way that Jack Rowlands would usually deal with it in. And I think that the common thing, the thing we're lucky to have in this country, is we still have police officers working in a way that genuinely wants to help make society better and wants to make that difference. And I think we've got people we can work with on this in policing. And young police officers that I see, that they seem to be a newer breed of thinkers, a newer breed of people that want to think differently and innovate. And I think that's something to celebrate and something to nurture and support. But I think also I want to pay tribute to partners that support policing. You know, when I look at mental health, I look at YOS, I look at youth workers. I think they're so critically underfunded that if they were supported correctly, policing could be part of that and have that sort of symbiotic relationship with partners that are funded properly and invested properly. And for me, going back to age zero, we need that investment in early years. You know, I know that we've had conversations with this before, but for me, I look at Sure Starts, I look at mental health nurses, I look at health visitors, I look at the root causes of what we need to invest in so that in a generation's time, policing isn't dealing with it because we've prevented it from happening in the root causes. And I think that is something we need as a society to really start thinking about, because that, for me, is how you then prevent violence. And then you have policing that goes back to the models that Rick was talking about earlier. And at the same time, hypothetically, from a panacea point of view, we don't deal with people in mental health crisis because as a society, we have dealt with it at the root cause. And we're not dealing with traumatized young people because they're supported at the very youngest age. So we need to always be mindful of that early years conversation and that overall investment in society that can benefit everyone, not just policing.
That's great. Thanks so much for that, Jack. And in particular, I think your points about, I think, symbiotic partnerships with agencies that are properly funded to do that work, I think is very well made. So we have time now for some kind of input from members. So I'm going to have a look on the chat. I'm going to kind of, I guess, just ask people to speak and maybe make their comments, but also perhaps just be mindful that we kind of want to give as many people an opportunity to speak as possible. So, and I think James is going to be able to, either the individual themselves can unmute themselves, but if not, then I think Jamie can help out with us. So I think, first of all, John Samuels, do you want to just make your comment?
Everything that Jack Rowlands said, I hope people can hear me now, I agree with, but Jack, who I've heard speak in the past and whom I've had the pleasure of meeting, is a very liberal-minded police officer. And I wish there were more like him. Unfortunately, long experience tells me that there are not. I would like to endorse the approach which Muir has identified, but would go a bit further. As the frontiers of criminal activity expand and Parliament legislates to create more and more criminal offences, so the role of the police in investigating that widening criminal landscape similarly widens. But COVID has shown us that functions previously adopted by what Rick describes as a public safety system can effectively be undertaken by others in the uniformed services, such as the military, have been undertaken in relation to testing the community in relation to COVID. So my suggestion in relation to this aspect of the discussion is that police public order functions currently undertaken by the police at very considerable expense, such as policing sporting functions, football matches when they come back into fashion, supervising elections, police officers standing outside polling stations as and when we next have an election in person, and all that kind of similar activity could, if money remains tight, be delegated to another uniformed service. That's my contribution for today.
Many thanks for that, John. Thanks for making that. So just to pick up some other contributions. So I'm going to go to Rebecca Banwell. Sorry, I'm just Rebecca Banwell Moore. Rebecca, over to you. I'm hoping you can either unmute yourself or that Jamie can do it.
Nope, I've done it. Hopefully you can hear me. Thanks to all three speakers today. I think mental health is a massive issue. We know that. And that's one that's come out in all three speakers as a priority. I guess for me, it's about what approach do we take to this and how do we have a triage system that actually is effective in terms of when police are dealing with a mental health incident, which is more and more the case. Are there specialist trained police officers in mental health that can be called out as sort of mental health champions to be able to deal with that. Because I think sometimes the approach that some officers take will actually escalate the episode or crisis that that individual is having. So if we took more of a restorative approach and a triage approach, then we might be actually able to diffuse that situation and free up time on the front line.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rebecca. I don't know whether Jack or Rick or Whitney want to come back on that at all. Any of you?
I would only, I'd only add further context to say that, policing, that, I've seen fantastic examples of how police have de-escalated situations. And in some cases, some service users have actually explained that we're glad police are here because we feel protected. But ultimately, should police officers be there when we could be visible, building relationships with community? Can anyone else do that job? I probably think they could. But sometimes things do need a police response based on high levels of violence and that critical time factor. But yeah, I think from a point of view of policing, in terms of our training, we've had a lot of input and a lot of awareness around what mental health is and how it presents itself in the community. But really, should we be dealing with all that demand? And I would always say that we need to invest in other areas for that to happen.
Okay. Thanks for that, Jack. So before going to Rick, I just want to say that I've picked up that I think Burku has a question that she wants to ask, and also Sai, Joshua, and we'll come to you in a moment. Okay, so Rick, if you want to just have a quick response back, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, just briefly, I mean, there are, there are street triage teams that do go out to respond to mental health incidents, often at night, where you have a health professional and police officers, in the same car and able to provide a more coordinated response. But I think Jack's right. Actually, what we need to do is we need to reduce the amount of mental health crisis. I mean, that's the only real solution to this. Is that why the amount of people needing mental health services has been increasing, and I think that's the key thing to tackle. So yes, absolutely more training, absolutely more working together with the health service and so on. We also need to tackle this thing about police officers spending so much of their time waiting in hospitals with people, waiting for people to be seen. And that goes back to NHS funding and resourcing. I mean, the amount of time that takes is just huge. And I don't think anyone thinks that's really what police officers should be spending lots of their time doing. So I think investment in community mental health services and all of that preventative end around mental health that's the real thing that would make a difference, I think.
Great, thanks, Rick. Okay, so
Kevin, can I just jump in as well? I just want to add one more thing to the conversation.
Sure.
There's also this element of the police and mental health are very white organizations, in a sense of, if you look at the research, if you look at the evidence, and you look at kind of the thinking processes behind it as well. And there is also some work that needs to be done that kind of sees mental health issues and neurodiversity through new lenses as well, because I think it's very, what I see kind of working with children and young people is mental health is picked up quite a lot in kind of working with young white kids, or kind of, and kind of autism, ADHD, all of these kind of things are kind of seen more in our younger white population, and then missed kind of with young black men, for example, or young black girls. And I think we also need to be very aware of, when we're speaking about things like mental health and neurodiversity, that there is also a wider context in play around power and who's being seen, and who's being seen for their mental health issues and their neurodiversity, and who's kind of having those kind of behaviors seen as they're bad, they're criminal, they need to go into prison as well. So there's an additional dialogue that needs to happen there as well.
Great, thanks for that, Whitney. So Burku, I hope that I pronounced your name correctly. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Over to you.
Thank you, Kevin. It's Borju.
Sorry.
Not making it easy by spelling my name non-phonetically. I'm Borju, I'm the policy manager at Revolving Doors. So thank you so much for organising this session, really interesting. Just a few comments on the mental health services and mental health response from the policing. So as we all know, there has been a big report coordinated by the HMICFRS in recent years showing how the police services are having to respond to mental health crisis increasingly because mental health services are unfunded. But regardless of the technicalities of funding, our feedback from our lived experience forums clearly show from the end user perspective, this does not work. On occasions, yes, there are individual officers that really do care and take time and respond well to mental health crisis, but often these are really distressing times and people feel embarrassed, humiliated, and it actually makes matters worse. So, in response to kind of Rick's question about, what is the role of policing going forward, I think we also need to have a conversation about what is not the role of policing, and clearly responding to mental health crisis isn't quite one of those. Changing dynamics and kind of issues around policing and crime is certainly an issue, but we are still seeing lots and lots of people being repeatedly arrested for low-level and often non-violent offences like theft offences, minor drug offences, and summary charges, which have not changed and in fact increased over the recent years. And what we know about this group of individuals is that they experience a tangle of disadvantage, stacking experiences of trauma, poor health, structural inequalities, and poverty, which really shape the way they experience the world, the services, and policing. And what we hear from our lived experience forum members is that there is a clear inverse correlation between the number of times a person encounters a policing response, and that includes welfare, crisis, and criminal justice responses, and their perceptions of the effectiveness and fairness of police services. So minimizing that contact and cushioning it with appropriate support services would be really, really crucial. And the third point, if I may, sorry, I'm very aware I'm taking time, is that we have had lots of discussions in this country and abroad around the disparities in the use of force, which need to continue, but we also need to have a conversation about the use of discretion and the disparities in that, because as Jack very rightly highlighted, we really need to think about diversion, who we are diverting and who we are not. But thank you.
Good. Thanks very much for that. So we're going to take two more contributions and then we're going to go into the next panel. Okay, so first one's from Sai, and the next one will be from Sade. So first of all, Sai, do you want to ask a question?
Oh, thanks very much, and thanks for having me on this afternoon. And it's been a pleasure to hear the speakers talk. I've learned a lot this afternoon. My name's Sai Joshua, and I'm from Race Equality First. And, it's quite very interesting that mental health has taken a focus this afternoon. I'm all for, looking at blended teams and partnership teams that are going out. I think it's something which should be brought more into how we react to issues within our communities, that blended approach. One of the things I picked up on is this idea of other services taking on the roles of policing, other uniform groups or other services within health. I think has already been alluded to. They've been decimated, these services recently, in terms of funding. So in terms of handing over these roles, I wonder where the money is going to come from in relation to being able to do that. I think it needs a bit of a transformational rethink in terms of how we sort of look at this going forward, if you want to move in that direction. But the question I really want to focus on is the culture within policing, and Whitney's touched on it in terms, and I think everyone's touched on it in terms of the trauma. But I do also see this culture of martyrism and over masculinity within policing, and it's matched with a culture of don't tell when when policing standards have been compromised and are witnessed by fellow officers. And if you've had your trust breached by a police officer within the community, you'll never get that back. And also that person will go and tell everybody they know about just how they being treated. And when you do complain, you get up, you find yourself up against a brick wall of nobody saw anything. In fact, it was the victim's fault. How do we deal with this culture of don't tell in relation to what happens in policing? Because from what I understand, when police officers do stand up and do the right thing when they've seen standards being breached by other officers, they can be targeted, they can be bullied, they can be harassed. There's a black mark put against their name in terms of when they get transferred. So how do we get over that in terms of building that trust? Because I think that's got a lot to play in relation to how we police in the future.
Great, thanks so much for the side. Now, unfortunately, because of timing, we don't have time to kind of try and ask for consider an answer to that. But that's a really well made point and a very, I think, helpful issue that we'd be great to come back to. So before we go on to the next panel, as I said before, Sade, if you were there, I think would you like to sort of hi, there you go. Hi there, over to you.
Hi, no, I didn't have anything to ask really per se. It was more just a statement about, we were talking about mental health and the impact of that. And I think there is something to be said about the cultural differences in mental health that Whitney highlighted, and how you manage different cultures in that way, because mental health displays itself differently in different cultures. And I think that's something that the police need to consider and to be more trained on cultural competency, both in mental health and just in general.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much for that. And we've got various comments people have made on the chat. And if we have time in the next sort of questions bit, we'll try and come back to that. But I would like to move on. So just to say that as a kind of absolute kind of guillotine of time, we are due to finish it at 3:30. So just to give you everyone a little bit of a breathing space, my understanding is that people will have received the director's report ahead of the members meeting. So whilst we did have some time allocated to that at the end of the meeting, I think Nina sort of indicated that we can kind of run into that. So with that in mind, and for the speakers of the three speakers at our next panel, if you could keep it relatively brief, that would be really much appreciated. So the question that I think we're looking at in this part of the meeting and for this panel session is a really important one, which is how can the legitimacy of policing be strengthened, particularly with those parts of our community amongst whom confidence in policing is low. And I think this comes from the Phase 1 report of the Strategic Review of Policing that's been produced by the Police Foundation. This quote, which is, "Black people and those of mixed ethnicity, both 60% are also less likely to agree that the police treat them fairly compared to white people, 67%. Okay, so to our first speaker in this panel session, I'd like to welcome Martin Underhill, who's the Dorset Police and Crime Commissioner, and Martin was re-elected for a second term in May 2016. Previously, it's worth noting that Martin was a Detective Chief Inspector of Sussex Police, retiring after 30 years of service. So over to you, Martin. I think you need to unmute yourself, Martin.
Hi, there you go. Okay, hi. Thanks, Kevin. And I'll try and stay to 8 minutes. I've got a lot to say, so I speak fast. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks ever so much for inviting me. And actually, the answer to this question, I think, was written by your charity in July this year when you gave your the Macpherson report 20 years on report to HASC, because that actually raises all the issues, some of which I'll talk about. So I'm a bit of a contradiction in terms, actually, as a police crime commissioner, because I hold the unfortunate record, and have done for 6 years, I think, of having the highest stop search rate disproportionality in England and Wales. In Dorset, which is, you would think, bizarre when we have a proportion of minorities of about 4 to 5%. And yet I lead nationally for the use of force, and some of you will know that I resigned my portfolio over my concerns about disproportionality over the use of taser. So there's two sides to one part of me there. And of course, I lead nationally for forensics, which I'll talk about at the end, because that's very relevant with bias coming out in algorithms. So let's start at the basics. It's already been mentioned by two speakers. Police officers pride themselves on being able to identify criminals. Policing by consent is the most important principle and underpins how we deliver our services. It recognises, as we do say, not by relying on the powers, but by our communities allowing us to be policed on our behalf. And we mustn't forget that, because I used to be a Metropolitan police officer. I was at the Brixton riots. I grew up in Germany for a few years. And our policing model is so different to Europe. And we must never forget that. We don't have armed police officers as routine, and we don't have the Stasi approach of the French or the Germans. So we do police by consent, and it's important that we understand that underpins everything we do. But if we lose that legitimacy, if the police don't have the consent of the community, then how can we police effectively? So it's important to understand that policing has a complex and challenging history with BAME communities. But whether we speak to those whose formative experience of policing were from their youth in the 70s, as mine were, because I was a young cop in the 70s, or from the youth of today, I think it's really depressing, actually. It's also very true that we hear the same three issues. One is a wholesale lack of trust in the police and the criminal justice system. And it's already been touched on by some of our speakers. If you're black, you will be disproportionately affected in every angle of criminal justice, including how many people are sectioned under Section 136. We talked about mental health a lot already this afternoon. There's a huge disproportionality and a wholesale lack of trust in that community, in the criminal justice system more widely. A view that they're not there to protect them, but to curtail their liberties. That's the police, that is. And thirdly, is a fundamental lack of understanding. And this is quite a key point worth spending time on, really. I mean, I started by saying police officers pride themselves on being able to identify criminals or those with criminal intent, but how do they do that? The truth is they're humans just like any of us, and they rely on cognitive shortcuts, on opinions, on experience, on views, decisions, and of course they make decisions that can be wrong. And I'm going to talk about that story that some of you will have heard of. It made the news in the last few days, the recent story of Dijon and Liam Joseph. So these are two brothers from South London who happened to encounter each other unexpectedly outside a Caribbean takeaway in Deptford. And they greeted each other with a fist bump. And the encounter was observed by the police, who mistook their completely innocent greeting for the possibility they were exchanging drugs. And they stopped and searched them. So why did they do that? Was it solely because the officers generally mistook that greeting, or was it the combination of the actions observed and what the brothers looked like? In this case, they were both black, they're both well over 6 feet tall, and one of them had dreadlocks. Was it because of their physical size that their behaviour was described by officers as aggressive? Would the fact they had between them been stopped 25 times and so have learnt it's best to swallow your pride and say nothing? Is that attitude the reason for them saying little when being stopped, or were they being incredibly evasive, as the police officers described them? Unfortunately, we won't know, as the police watchdog, the IOPC, confirmed that officers declined to answer their questions and was therefore concluded there was insufficient evidence for a misconduct hearing against them or anything to prove discrimination. Now, that's a depressing story, isn't it? And we know that the position's improved and officers are now required to cooperate with the IOPC investigations, even if they resign. But clearly in this case, and in numerous others, I could give numerous examples, and so could most people on this call, policing has done itself no favours in breaking down the barriers between it and the community it polices. And of course, I'm going to draw a parallel, why wouldn't I, with the public inquiry that started a week last Monday, in which undercover officers deployed into the Lawrence family for absolutely no reason. So what can be done? How do we strengthen that legitimacy when you've got a history like I've just explained? How can policing rebuild its trust within our communities? Well, we'll all be familiar with the terms conscious and unconscious bias, and I'm going to talk about bias later with algorithms. And my own force, like others, struggles with this, and I've been really pleased that we've now brought in an experienced chartered psychologist to undertake a range of testing to measure people's ethnicity bias. And my office has pushed hard for this. I've spoken to Nina and your charity over 4 years as to how do I get off the naughty step? Why am I the highest disproportionate force for stop search in this country? And yet when it comes to taser, we are the lowest. It's bizarre and it's worrying. And so we've managed to bring in this bias training and testing to make sure that all new officers joining Dorset will be tested and then will be retested throughout their 26-week initial training. And you may think that's overkill, but it's a small price to pay actually to understand the challenges we face and to ensure we do not turn out officers who will engage in behaviour like that seen by Dijon and Liam in Deptford. And we also have a huge effort underway to recruit BAME staff, and we're working hard to ensure the collective voices of our current BAME staff are heard. And in fact, Simon, who chairs our BAME group, is on this call. But I won't lie, it's a significant challenge, and I described it several times as pushing water up a hill, trying to get policing to accept that it's acting disproportionately, and why are they doing that is very difficult. But all these challenges which have come from me and the things we've introduced, some of which I've just spoken about, they may be small actions, but they all take us towards a direction that we want to see change. And I've no doubt that change will be slow coming, to be honest. I've been in policing for 40 years. I've already explained I was at the Brixton riots. And I can say that although the critical mass is moving, it's taken a long time to move. And for me, for the first time in a long time, I have to say, and I said this to Nina the other day, I have now got some hope, but it's taken a long time to see that hope. And the last thing from me in closing, because I'm very aware of time, the journey that we've been on over disproportionality in policing and keeping the public consent and the public support in what we do, what the police do, must include a standard approach to citizen panels. They've been talked about briefly. CJA has done a report on citizen panels. PCCs have answered a survey on citizen panels, and I've got a citizen panel. I'm very proud to have introduced, probably the first in the UK actually, but they're not standard, and your report highlights that. We have different people chairing, we have different review methods. It's all very haphazard, and actually I think you need a standard approach for the citizen-focused panels that hold the police to account in relation not just to stop search, but in relation to use of force and other issues. And I think I mentioned them earlier, that journey has to include the IOPC. I see the IOPC as crucial in moving that critical mass and changing officer behaviour and officer attitudes. And I don't know how much you liaise with the IOPC, but I see them as a crucial partner in changing this movement so that we can get back to public support and public trust, particularly amongst our BAME communities. And the final issue for me is the challenge, actually, which no one else has mentioned yet, about the police tactic of stop search. My head was reeling, quite frankly, over a 4-year period with different Home Secretaries giving different directions on police stop search. We had bus 1, best use of stop search, for those who don't know what that means. At 1, then we had bus 2, and then we had our lovely Priti Patel come in, who said, rip all that up and I want everybody stop search. As long as they're breathing, they can be stop searched. And so we've gone from, we've completely flipped in 4 years, which is really confusing for policing. It's also very confusing for the population that they police. And actually, again, going back to the CJA report, it's no surprise then that Met stops, London stops, have increased by 50% in a year. But worryingly, I'll go back to the tactic of stop search. Why are 70% of those stop searches drug-based? And only 15% knives and serious violence. Actually, if you ask the average member of the public, why do the police stop people? It's normally, they'll say knives, they'll say guns, very few of them will say drugs. And yet 70% of London searches are drugs-based. So is that tactic alone causing disproportionality as well as the racial bias that we know exists? And that's the challenge I've laid at the door of my Chief Constable. Simon and I have both laid that challenge. Prove to us this tactic works, because we don't think it does. And if you stop the tactic, you stop the disproportionality. And that's without discussing Section 60. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to talk very briefly about algorithms. So I lead nationally for forensics, which means I have a hot potato in my lap, even more hot than having the most disproportionate police force in the country for stop search, and that is facial imaging. And I am overseeing the 2 pilots in South Wales and London, along with other colleagues. And one of the issues of facial imaging as we move more and more towards technology is AI and algorithms. And it's interesting because you expect to hear police leaders talking more and more about algorithms and the potential for bias. But actually, if you drill down into it, they struggle to explain it, because if I said to most senior police officers, what is an algorithm and what's underneath the hood? What's underneath the bonnet? How does that engine work? They wouldn't know. It's hugely complex. And one thing I found, because I started challenging software suppliers to say, what is your algorithm and how does it work, is they're reluctant to submit them to scrutiny. So this, for me, to finish my speech, suggests a need for caution and a serious effort by the police service to maximise the oversight, governance and ethics of the new capabilities that are being introduced, which will help erode public confidence in policing unless we're really careful. Placing inappropriate trust in algorithms, particularly those that exploit machine learning, can undermine potential contributions to improving performance for policing. And I'm going to finish, actually, as I started. It's important to remember bias is always driven by people. Algorithms need governance, they need scrutiny. Otherwise, you will find more bias coming into policing as technology evolves. So I hope I've dealt with a few issues there. I could talk for hours. I lead nationally for mental health as well. I help write the mental health concordat for both children and adults under mental health. So I haven't even touched on mental health because I could talk for hours about that. I hope I've given you a few things to think about. I've no idea how long I spoke for, but I hope it was roughly around 8 to 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Martin. So I think we've had some comments on that, which is from members who suggested that thank you for your honest account of the realities of today, which is, I think, both refreshing but also very, very pertinent. So thanks so much for that. So I'm moving on to our next speaker. And before I do that, something that Jamie did ask me to do, and then I kind of forgot, unfortunately, between the 2 panel sessions, was just to say, if you are a member of the CJA and you joined the meeting slightly later, after we'd had the annual accounts, please could you write in the chat that you agree with the annual accounts. You'll have had them sent to you. So it's just a plea for anyone who hasn't so far kind of endorsed the annual accounts, please do so in the chat. Okay, thanks very much. So on to Rachel Waldron, who's the Independent Custody Visitor Manager and Compliance Lead for the City of London Police Authority. And she also leads on custody matters and police complaints on behalf of the Police Authority. And she's previously spent time volunteering as a constituency caseworker and Samaritans a volunteer. So Rachel, if you could, I was looking for you here on the screen. Oh, hi, sorry, hi there. Okay, over to you, Rachel. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon all, and thanks very much for inviting me to come and speak. I'm just going to touch really briefly on who I am and what my role is in terms of corporation that I work at. So I work at the City of London Corporation, and I currently work as the Police Authority Compliance Lead. In terms of my role, it's essentially split into 2 parts, as outlined by Kevin. I'm the Independent Custody Visitor Scheme Manager and the Police Authority Complaints Manager. To touch briefly on my role with regards to complaints, those that might know, the City of London Corporation is slightly unique in the sense that it has what we call the Court of Common Council, which is the City of London's kind of primary decision making body, and is responsible for delegating the responsibilities of the police to the Police Authority Board. We also, I should say, the role of the board is also quite essential to ensuring that the City of London Police runs an effective and efficient service. So that can involve doing things like holding the Commissioner to account, ensuring that value for money is offered in the way that the police run and operate their services. But also sitting within that is the Professional Standards and Integrity Committee of the Police Authority Board, which plays quite an important role in scrutinising and having oversight of the City of London Police. As such, it's responsible for handling things like complaints where appropriate and conducting reviews of complaints handled by the force. My role as complaints manager is an interesting one, as I essentially review complaints about the police from members of the public, which can cover a whole host of issues, including dealing with really vulnerable members of society, And I work quite closely with the City of London Police Professional Standards Department and the IOPC. The types of complaints that I can look at can include sort of grievances where individuals have regarding things like fraud. I'm not sure if everybody's aware, but the City of London Police is the lead force for fraud. They work really closely with partners and other sorts of law enforcement agencies to provide like a linked up response to tackle and kind of combat crime and fraud. I also look at sort of complaints regarding professional standards and behaviour of officers with regards to things like stop and search processes, the execution of things like search warrants, and any kind of police involvement that police officers generally tend to have when engaging with wider members of the public and responding to incidents. So it's really important from that point of view to understand the processes and policies involved in particular police practices, and check that they're undertaken and conducted correctly, both for the purposes of identifying any kind of corrective action that may need to follow on from such complaints or incidents, like the issuing of perhaps an apology or further training for some officers that have been involved in particular incidents. So in that respect, for the police complaints, it's an important area to cover correctly, as I think it's well known that the outcomes provided to complainants can really go on to shape and inform the confidence and trust that members of the public experience with the force. Moving on slightly to the second hat of my role, I guess, with the independent custody visiting, as scheme manager for the independent custody visiting committee at the corporation. I'm responsible for highlighting and escalating, and I'd probably say resolving really, issues raised by our independent custody visitors regarding custody provision in the city. I'm also responsible for resolving recommendations that emerge from the HMI CFRS reports following unannounced inspections of the force's custody suites. Some of the recent recommendations have included things like the implementation of suitable exercise provision for detainees whilst in detention, and also the provision of an appropriate adult service, which provide assistance to those vulnerable individuals and juveniles that are held in detention at all times. Really, it's a 24/7 service, so really important work to kind of do there, and of course the new challenges that we've seen more recently across the coronavirus outbreak. So lots of considerations to bear in mind in terms of ensuring that detainees have the appropriate access to equipment that they may need. So whether that be showers, hand washing facilities, all of those things that are quite challenging, I think, in respect to ensuring that everybody has access to whilst they're in detention. I also sit on the board of directors for ICVA, which is the Independent Custody Visiting Association. We're currently working quite closely with the Criminal Justice Alliance and pulling together research, which is looking and thinking about how to take forward issues on diverse ICV recruitment, training, retention, and looking at how ICV kind of monitor equalities with a focus on gender and race, and how that sits within the ICV role. So it's really important, I think, in terms of diversity and inclusion, to concentrate on that and make sure that the work that we do undertake in that area is done correctly, as I think we can all kind of recognise that certain individuals and groups within society suffer discrimination, on the grounds of age, sex, sexual orientation, race, colour, all of those things. So lots of important work to do there. But I think I'll probably pause at that point, because I'm sure I've probably rambled on for quite a while, and I know that other people will be needing to make contributions. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thanks very much, Rachel. I mean, that's been, I think, really interesting, and also giving us an insight into those different roles that you occupy, which I think are very kind of critical, I think, for having a kind of a level of scrutiny. So hopefully we'll get some kind of questions in a moment, and we've got time. I'll hopefully have time for that. So I'm going to move to our last speaker, Amal Ali, who is a policy officer here at the CJA, and Amal joined us from Release, which is a National Centre for Expertise in Drugs and Drugs Law, where she managed a national youth-led stop and search project. And also, I think I'm right in saying, I think, Amal, that recently you've joined the Independent Monitoring Board at HMP Brixton. I think that's right to say. Okay, so over to you, Maud. Again, if you can keep it reasonably brief, that'd be great. Thank you.
I'll try my best, Kevin. I did send over some slides to Jamie, who if just bringing those up. But yeah, afternoon all. So as Kevin mentioned, prior to me joining the CJA, I'd managed a youth-led stop and search project, and often concerns around trust, legitimacy were persistent and came up time and time again. So the question and topic, and today's topic, is of some interest of mine and has been for some time. Just waiting for the slides to come up. Cool. So next slide. Great. So there's probably more ways than 3 to improve legitimacy in the police, but I'll be focusing on the following 3 points. So the first being effective scrutiny of police powers, particularly those that disproportionately impact Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups. The second being improved transparency of data relating to police powers. And the third being greater adherence to the public sector equality duty. So one way to strengthen police legitimacy is by allowing communities to scrutinize the use of police powers. So there are already mechanisms in place for doing this, for example, community scrutiny panels, independent advisory groups, and so on. These mechanisms can be effective vehicles for driving change and engaging over-policed communities, providing that external forum for accountability. But for these mechanisms to work in practice, they do require some investment and resource. So in 2019, we launched our Stop and Scrutinize report. It looks at how community scrutiny mechanisms could be used to hold the police to account around stop and search. And what the briefing did is it highlighted 4 key principles. I'm going to whiz through them very quickly. The first being that panels had to be independent and empowered. For example, they shouldn't be chaired by a representative of the police. Instead, this had to be someone who was independent from them. The second being that they were to be informed. So the panels had to have access to a wide range of data, including body-worn video footage and not just stop and search receipts. The third being they were to be representative. So panels should reflect the communities most impacted by the power, particularly Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups and young people. And the final principle being around open and visible. So panels were, when effective, were working in the community, but also publishing minutes and action plans from meetings. So since the publication, these principles have been taken on board and been expanded on by the College of Policing as part of an enhancement on their guidance around community engagement and scrutiny. Next slide. So the enhancement to the guidance was published in July and builds on some of those principles that were discussed in the earlier slide. Again, in the interest of time, I won't be going through all of these principles, but I'll just touch on 2 very quickly. One of the principles around community scrutiny mechanisms needing to be purposeful. So having clear aims, responsibilities, and terms of reference. And really what community scrutiny panels need to be doing is focusing on the issues that impact or are of greatest concern to local communities, so they're contextualized. For example, if there were issues in terms of searches being conducted on children and vulnerable groups, race disproportionality grounds or authorizations for searches. Another principle was around the need for scrutiny panels to be influential. So panel members should be able to affect change by engaging in constructive oversight and dialogue and bringing about that challenge. And while we welcome the guidance, the College of Policing unfortunately has no mandate to enforce this. And since its publication, what's become quite evident is a lot of PCC areas and force areas are not even aware of the enhancement, let alone its implementation. In terms of what we would now like to see, just keeping with that, we believe it's important for the Home Office to establish a national body for community scrutiny stop and search panels, similar to the Independent Custody Visitors Association. So that would be bringing together this network of panels to A, both share good practice, but B, also be looking at data, stop and search data, and sort of that would be making us move away from this postcode lottery where we're seeing some stop and search scrutiny panels and good engagement with scrutiny panels in some force areas and not in others. Which then brings me on to my second ask around community scrutiny panels needing to be mandated in every police force area and supported to effectively scrutinize stop and search powers. And then my second point is around transparency. So often we hear that body-worn video footage is an effective tool in increasing public trust and confidence. It's also said to enhance transparency and legitimacy. Some scrutiny panels actually have access to body-worn video footage. But again, there's a lack of consistency as to how many panels are able to review this footage. A quick example, the Met account for the largest number of stop and searches and often skew figures. If we're talking about just in terms of disproportionality or stop and searches more broadly, which is why it was concerning and we were a little taken aback when we heard that the Met were no longer sharing body-worn video footage with members of community scrutiny panels and sort of citing legal responsibilities under GDPR and data protection. So that announcement actually came, or that suspension came at the beginning of this year. So following consultation with the Information Commissioner's Office, the College of Policing guidance on the screen now says that body-worn video footage can be viewed as part of community scrutiny, so long as safeguards are in place. However, it is for forces to decide whether or not to allow footage to be viewed. And that's because there's currently no legal requirement. So we know that body-worn video footage is not currently being used or not always used as it should be. So many of you may have seen the IOPC's review into the Met's use of stop and search more recently and found that there was a failure for the force to be using body-worn video footage from the outset of contact. In terms of what we would now like to see, a review into the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, or PACE, Code A, with a particular focus on the use and sharing of body-worn video footage. So there's not, as far as I'm aware, there's not been a revision to the code for the past 5 years, and actually it falls silent on things such as body-worn video footage and may benefit from an update. But also, I guess, the inclusion of body-worn video footage in the code would sort of make data protection issues or that hurdle much easier for forces to overcome. And then the second ask being around to create a national stop and search database or dashboard. So we're currently doing a piece of work around Section 60s. And as part of this work, we sent out a number of freedom of information requests to all police forces in England and Wales. And actually the response that we got back was quite damning and telling in itself. So a number of police forces responded to our FOI request saying that while they had the data, it couldn't actually be extracted. So they just didn't have the mechanisms in place to extract that data. There was also inconsistencies between forces using self-defined ethnicity and officer perceived ethnicity, making it considerably harder to analyze that data, calculate disproportionality rates and draw any meaningful conclusions. And then there were further inconsistencies around how forces were recording things such as age. So different age brackets, one force might record, might group ages under 17 in one bracket, whereas another force might put 10 to 15 and then 16 to 21. And yeah, again, that making it difficult to analyze. And then that sort of brings me to my final point. And sort of raises questions around the police's obligation around the public sector equality duty and whether forces are actually reviewing data. So this duty was developed to harmonise equality duties for public bodies such as the police. and compliance with this public duty is a legal obligation. I guess the concern for us is that there isn't any due regard that's being shown to the public sector equality duty by police forces, either nationally at a Home Office level or locally. So an example of this being equality impact assessments for the Section 60 pilot, which saw elements of the best use of stop and search scheme, which Martin was referring to earlier, relaxed, and then a subsequent national rollout. So the equality impact assessment actually warned of the risk of race disparity, yet the policy was adopted. We've also sent out a number of freedom of information requests to forces to find out if they were actually conducting equality impact assessments locally. And again, response was quite damning. None of the forces that responded had actually said they'd conducted an equality impact assessment. I guess it's also important to stress that the public sector equality duty places an obligation to foster good relationships between those who have a protected characteristic. This is extremely important as we're sort of moving away. Well, we're seeing a trend in policing which may further erode trust and damage that trust and confidence in the police. So I think Martin was referring to it earlier in terms of increased stop and search. Even during lockdown at the height of the pandemic, you know, we were seeing a surge in stop and searches by the Met, but then low levels of arrest, increased or high levels of disproportionality, and then the government's most recent proposal to introduce serious violence reduction orders, which, you know, places an emphasis on surveillance rather than support and rather than tackling those underlying issues and wider social conditions that need to be addressed. And I guess what we would like to see is that an actual review of the equality impact assessment process. So even when they are being produced, my example earlier speaks to this point, that they don't actually have any real teeth to influence policy. There are also questions about how frequently they're being conducted by forces. Are they being co-produced with over-policed communities, or are they just internal documents? And if they are being produced internally without any public consultation, then how well does the assessor understand the needs and the risks posed to communities? Which then sort of brings me into this last point around the police not being seen to be as legitimate until they are representative, until they represent the communities they serve. So currently nationally, from my understanding, there's no police force that is actually representative of the community it's serving. And I think when we talk about police representation, we don't just mean the PCSOs, we don't just mean the police and community support officers, we don't just mean the police constables, we mean at all ranks, at all levels. So yeah, that's me. That's the end of my presentation.
Great, thanks very much for that, Amal. So I'm really conscious of time. So I want to kind of hold back a little bit of time for Nina to make some kind of final points, final remarks. So I think if I can take 3 kind of comments from people who've indicated something on the chat. So first of all, Whitney, if you'd like to just highlight your comment about IAGs, I think it was.
Yeah, I was just saying that, you know, I've always had an issue with the independent advisory groups, especially in London, and actually how independent they are, because there's no systems of protection. So, you know, you already have to go through vetting to get onto the group, which puts a lot of barriers in place anyway. And then if the police don't like you, or the police kind of, you know, all the police really need to say is they have some kind of intelligence on you, don't even need to disclose that, and they can kick you off of the board. So there's no actual, from kind of my previous knowledge and experience, there's no systems of protection for the civilians that actually engage with the police. Okay, many thanks for that. So there's an issue there about how that sort of decision making is, who's on it, it needs to be scrutinized. So if I can move to Lamin, you were talking about tracking outcomes, I think. There we go, Lamin.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so I work for Voyage Youth, and my question is more around as I said, sort of in the chat, we've had multiple reports from the Macpherson report all the way to Lammy's report. We've had multiple engagements, we've had multiple reviews, sort of, and it goes on and on and on. And sort of, I'm sort of a young Black person growing up in the community, so we've heard the stories from our forefathers and the ones who came before us. And what we've seen is that the same conversation, the same issues have been recurring for generations. So that tells me that there must be some sort of problem with how do we track these conversations and the outcomes in a more meaningful way, and what are the best metrics? Because ultimately, if people from a BAME community are feeling like we're having the same issues, same questions for years and years and years, then that obviously will have an impact on the trust we have for the system and the policing system and also the criminal justice system. So that was some of the thoughts and comments I had to make.
No, thanks so much for that. I think that those points are very well made, and I think that certainly very pertinent. Okay, so I think last comment, if we can, from Sherry Ralph.
I wasn't really anticipating on saying anything.
We have the floor, Sherry. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much. It was just a bit of a plug, actually, for some work ICFA are doing around custody visiting, which feeds into the legitimacy point,
right?
Which is reviewing our methodology and saying, well, actually, is the way that we currently undertake monitoring of police custody effective? And does that in any way assist to legitimacy? So there's kind of two prongs to it, really. One is the work that we're doing with the CJA, which Rachel has described. And the other is a review into our methodology. And I just very cheekily popped a link in the chat. So if anyone would like to have a look, and you could always get in touch with us at info@ICFA if you'd like to. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sherry. And okay, literally the last comment. So Faiza, over to you.
Just quickly, I just wanted to stress the importance of recognizing the intersections of identity. So often we're focused on race, and what we're finding is that, we have to ensure that we are looking at all 9 protected characteristics all the time. And it can't just be a focus on race, because often that brings in so many other issues. So I'll stop there because I know you're tight on time.
Okay, thanks so much for that. So keep on saying this is the last question, but this is the last question before I hand over to you. So I think Sarah Uncles, you had something a question you wanted to ask, Sarah. Over to you.
Hi there. Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm from a charity called Inquest. I think the conversation on stop and search and the stark disproportionality here was really interesting, and certainly a conversation worth having. I guess I just wanted to point that racial disproportionality isn't just in relation to stop and search, and obviously extends further than that, also in the use of force, with Black people in London 4 times more likely to have use of force used against them than white people, and of course in deaths that happen in police custody as well. So I just wanted to flag, many people might be familiar with the inquest into the death of Kevin Clark. He died in 2018 after police restraint whilst he was in mental health crisis. Now, the jury at the inquest found that the officer's decision to use restraint was inappropriate, and that it wasn't based on a balanced assessment of risks to the public and police, and also to Kevin. And I mean, they concluded that he was generally cooperative and responsive up until the point where officers laid hands on him. And the body-worn video of that was particularly difficult to watch. I guess, sort of leading on from what Lamin was talking about in terms of reviews not being sort of followed through, or, not really understanding the progress of reviews. There was the Angelini review that was published 3 years ago, which made wide-ranging recommendations from policing and also the health service and also the justice systems, and recommendations within the review sought to address the concerns raised in the Kevin Clark case and others, especially highlighting the fact that all restraint can cause death, the heightened dangers when someone is in mental health crisis, and for the police to understand institutional racism and its impact. I guess, if time allows, I wanted to know what insight the panel had into, what needs to happen to prevent further deaths in police custody, and whether, they've seen police forces and other areas, the justice system, sort of implement these recommendations from the Angelini review. There are a lot of them. There are 100 recommendations, but unfortunately, the levels of deaths in custody remain at a rate consistent with 10 years ago. So really, you know, if we're looking at those figures, what progress has been made? Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Sarah. So I think Martin's happy to kind of make a response to, I think, the question you raised, Sarah. So over to you, Martin.
Sarah and Lamin, both really good points. I'll speak as the Police Crime Commissioner, who is also the chair of ICFA, and obviously Sherry's on the call, but I do chair the Independent Custody Visitors Association. And Dame Angelini today, I don't know if you saw in the press, she's done another review of Scottish policing, where she's suggesting that every death in custody should be treated like a homicide. And actually, controversial though that is, and off the record, because I haven't even spoken to Sherry about it yet, I support that. Actually, how can we have a consistent amount of deaths in custody for a decade? That is unacceptable. We have to do something different. There has to be a step change to stop that. And actually, if they're treated as homicides in the cell blocks, actually that might be the step change we need. So that again has come from Dame Angelini. And I'm a great supporter of hers, and I'm really, really upset that none of her recommendations have been implemented. So I'm with Sarah totally on that.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Martin. According to my clock here, we've got kind of 4 minutes. So I do want to try and hold a little bit of time and for Nina to make some closing remarks and to make any other announcements she wishes to make. And I know that characteristically she's been somewhat muted, I guess, in terms of being able to say very much so far. So
just before I come in, Kevin, if Rachel and Amal just want to come back on any of those points, I don't need very long because everyone's had my report. So.
Okay, right. Okay, Rachel and Amal, do you want to comment on, I think, any of the things that have been said?
Just in terms of Whitney's comment with regards to independent advisory groups perhaps not being seen as independent as they should be, and I think that was something that was identified in Stop and Scrutinise report, which sort of mapped stop and search panels. But yeah, again, it is something that the College of Policing's guidance has encouraged, and we think by establishing sort of this national oversight body that would then encourage that to be happening on more local levels and ensuring that they would be more independent. But again, it's something that needs to be embedded by the Home Office. So it's something that we'll continue to push for and call for.
Okay, thanks for that. So Rachel, did you have a point to make for this? Or
I didn't. I just have to say that I think that's been a pretty comprehensive overview by everybody, actually. So I'm not going to add anything further. Thank you.
So one last point from members. From Sade, do you want to say something?
Yes, all I wanted to say really in regards, and I'm happy to speak to anyone else outside of this, I'm a former employee of the IOPC, so I'm very familiar with how it works and investigations and how they work. And the D. John Joseph case, I had quite a lot of involvement in and understand it very well. Martin, happy to discuss at any time if you want. But my thoughts are that in terms of scrutiny, I think there's a lot of onus being put on stop and search panels in order to identify racial disproportionality within forces. That is the responsibility of the force to identify those issues and therefore work through them, explain or reform. But that doesn't seem to happen because, as I've been told by officers from the Met, their role is to enforce the law, not to actually understand the dynamics and the racial dynamics within it, which in itself tells you that if their view of their force is to enforce, not to actually prevent or look at other options or see why people are heading towards crime, then that reactive approach will always lead to disproportionality, because as far as they're concerned, they're just carrying out their job and not actually assessing why Black people are more likely to be stopped versus white people. So I think the scrutiny element should be left to the organizations who are being paid and funded to do it, and they should do that with the support of panels, but I don't think the responsibility should be the panel. The IOPC needs to work effectively in making them accountable, making police forces accountable. And I know they only work on a small number of investigations, but if they demonstrate that they have the teeth to make sure that people are brought to justice when needs be, then actually I think communities will be more inclined to believe in the system and to use that system effectively, so we can highlight the issues, because the other issue is that most people don't complain about discrimination, even if they think that it's happening, because discrimination isn't seen. If you write it down on paper, it's sometimes quite difficult to explain. It can come in subtle forms and microaggressions and so on. So I think there is a place for the IOPC to step up their work and identify those areas and be bold in their reports and their statements and be clear about their position on certain things, so that groups like the Black community are able to see that there is a stance being taken by those organisations to effectively change the racial disparity that currently stands. So I'm not saying that the other elements aren't important, because I think they are, but I think there's a massive role to be played in scrutiny, because if you're going to do scrutiny, it needs to be proper scrutiny, not just, you know, sort of ticking a box and writing a report so that we can say we looked at it. It should actually be a decision, and I think there's something about legislative power that needs to be given to the IOPC in order to do that. But that's another conversation. But yeah, I think that's the role that they need to play.
Okay. Thanks very much. And can I just say, before I hand over to Nina, just thanks to all our speakers and also the input from members. It's been really interesting, stimulating, and certainly something that we at the CJA will kind of pick up and try and sort of reflect, I think. So over to you, Nina.
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, just to echo your comments, yeah, just to sort of say these are huge subjects that I'm sure we could, you know, talk for hours on, and this is really just the start of the conversation, and this is what the CJA has been, you know, doing now for a number of years, but, you know, it's really core to our strategy and core to our sort of a lot of our policy work, both in terms of our proactive policy work, like our, you know, the projects that we're doing with ICFA and the IMB, but also in terms of the reactive work. And I just want to kind of give a big thanks to Amal for all the work that she's done during the lockdown. There's been a lot of reactive work and policy consultations that's been going on behind the scenes that we've been responding to, whether it's on the McPherson report or in relation to disparities in terms of COVID, that Amal's been doing sort of behind the scenes. Just want to sort of raise a couple of points. One about the work that we've been doing on COVID, just to say that the two reports that we launched in the summer, Routes to Recovery and Responding Restoratively to COVID-19, they've now been, you know, disseminated out to policymakers and stakeholders. We've had having some really good responses back on that, and we're hoping to have an event, we hope on the 10th of December, with Jill Attrill, who's Deputy Director for HMPPS Insights team, with members, so that she can kind of give the response for HMPPS and have an opportunity to actually have a discussion with her rather than just as a written response. So I think that's really positive. So we'll keep you engaged on that. And just to sort of final plug, as Kevin said about the awards, Jamie's been working really hard, and Paul, our paid intern through the Longford Trust, on getting the awards ready for this year. Unfortunately, obviously it can't be in person, but we've got some good things lined up to make the award ceremony, the virtual award ceremony, really enjoyable, because, you know, as Kevin mentioned, this has been a really challenging year on many fronts, and there's been some incredible people, as you'll see, shortlisted, working on issues such as this, issues around race disparity, issues around, you know, COVID, who've really kind of pulled out all the stops this year that we want to kind of take a moment to recognise and to celebrate their work. So please do join us, because it's virtual. We can have an unlimited number of people join us. So it's on the 26th of November in the evening, and the link comes through on our CJA bulletin. And just a bit of a plug as well in terms of the work that Jamie's been doing with our Meet the Member blogs and things like that. So if you want to be represented in one of those, do let Jamie know. And we've also been working behind the scenes. Jamie has on a new website, which will be launched in the new year as well. So lots going on. Yeah, really excited to have Jamie and Amal on board, and Kevin is our new chair, Carol is our new treasurer, Kimberly is a new trustee. And yeah, great to have lots of members on this call as well. So yeah, this is just the start of this conversation, and we look forward to working with our expert groups and others. If you're on this call and want to be involved in one of our expert groups to carry on this conversation, do drop myself or Amal an email, and we'll make sure that you're involved in our expert groups as we take this work forward. So thank you very much, everybody.
That's great. Okay, so one final plug. So please, we'd love to see you at the awards in a couple of weeks' time. So please join us for that. But again, thank you all for your input, and finishing just about on time, which I'm getting a little bit obsessed about. But anyway, so I hope you enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are, and thank you for turning up today and for your great input. Okay, so take care and see you all soon.